I want to get your point on the difference between the reactions from Ethiopians overall, and some of the differences compared to Ethiopians that have roots in Tigray or that have one parent from Tigray. For whatever reason, they identify with Tigray more than they do Ethiopia at this point. You have roots in Tigray, and I didn't know that actually until very recently, because I didn't need to know that. I just knew you were Professor Beniam Awash. Like, we've been on panels together, talking about sanctions. But I think it's interesting. So I have to ask you, everybody knows my story, so no need to repeat it. But what is it about, your story that helps you see through the propaganda? Because some people are having a very difficult time.
So I don't think it's necessarily the biography of an individual, right? Because you can have people that are from Tigray, and in many ways, there are many people that are well-meaning and that are good people, but they have a completely misconstrued nature, right, of the events and of what's happening, or even a misunderstanding, if you will, of the TPLF. Or there's some that also, for instance, have a sense of the TPLF as a party that neglected Tigray, as a party that is also well known for its highly ruthless way of monitoring and checking Tigrayans. One of the places that's like a dungeon, so to speak, in Ethiopia was Tigray. Over 40 plus years, a single party that has absolute control from top to the smallest village does not even allow a single radio station, does not allow a plurality of ideas, people to express themselves as they wish, does not allow young people to have social groupings, to think about political projects and form political projects. Can somebody run for mayor of Mekelle or Aksum? A young person that has ambitions, that has ideas? No, they cannot. And so I think there's an element here that's very important, that the relationship between the TPLF and the Tigrayan population, and it depends on which Tigrayan population. I live out here in the United States. My roots, yes, I was born in Mekelle. I know Tigray as a beautiful place, a fabulous place in terms of its geography. It's a place that is yagetal በአማርኛ. So it's a place that has a necklace of historic Ethiopian civilizational relics, from Aksum to historical places like Adwa. So I know this place as a beautiful place. I know the Tigrayan people, those that I know, my cousins, my relatives, those that I meet, as people that are very conservative, they're very religious, they're very hardworking, they're extremely proud of their history. And for me, one of the most shocking aspects of this war, because I'm used to war, unfortunately, I've seen war in Ethiopia, and this is not the first time. But the most shocking aspect is the fact that the Ethiopianness of Tigrayans and Tigray is being questioned and in fact denied, not by other Ethiopians, by those that claim to speak in the name of Tigray. It was one of the worst and shocking aspects as well of this. Of course, the human tragedy, there's no question about that. So I also wanted to point kind of one thing, I think, which is I just wanted to bring to our conversation, and that's going back again to uh, November 4, 2020. And why is it so important? If you notice, this coming November 4 is going to be the 2-year mark, and it's going to be celebrated almost in a similar fashion as Adwa. Adwa was a point to celebrate about the sacrifices that are made to maintain Ethiopia as a country and its sovereignty. The fight that we have now is not about some sort of fight with Tigrayans or a cultural group. The fight is to maintain Ethiopia's sovereignty and independence. And so the celebration, November 4, 2022, is going to be both a mourning of what happened to these soldiers that were in Tigray for over 20 years. Many of you know these soldiers were there serving to protect Tigrayans, and yet they are going to be destroyed and humiliated by this organization that speaks in the name of Tigray. which already makes it a contradiction. How could that possibly be, right? So I think it's also an important sort of element to understand. And so we need to emphasize here that the Tigrayan people are Ethiopians. They're not despised. They're not thought of as non-Ethiopians. The Ethiopian government, I'm very much vested in this. I'm watching the behavior and conduct of the Ethiopian government, that they should do right by the people of Tigray. The people of Tigray for over 2 years have been held captive. They've been kidnapped. The entire province has been kidnapped. That's the narrative that we should have seen and heard from the West. But the West is not interested in the people of Tigray. All you have to do is turn across the Red Sea and see the beautiful people of Yemen. Has anybody heard about them? Do we hear Security Council meetings? Do we hear the Europeans? Do we hear the Irish running with their hair on fire, screaming about what's happening to the people of Yemen, despite the fact that the British are helping with intelligence and providing the bombs necessary to drop bombs, despite the fact that there's a siege, a sanction to stop food and medicine and fuel from entering Yemen, despite the fact that this results in the proliferation of cholera. Save the Children had to make an announcement that this is the worst episode of cholera ever that it's recorded, right? Worst humanitarian disaster. So it's not that Ethiopian lives matter or Tigrayans' life matter. These are all small chips in a much larger game that's being played. The only people that care about Ethiopian lives or Tigrayan lives, yourself, the Ethiopian government, those that are working around the clock to try to raise funds and help, right? These are the ones that care. The Ethiopian government doesn't even have to be a moral agent, but if it does not do right by the Tigrayan people, it will have a headache, right?
Yeah,
Very
yeah,
simple. Very simple.
absolutely.
Even if we're, if you, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Professor.
Now, I was going to say that even if we're skeptical, so this is not even a question of the individual characteristics of members of the political party, the Prosperity Party, etc. This is a very simple fact that if you're going to have a country and a country to rule, you need law and order. And so a government cannot actually have different parts of its country being ruled by gangs of individuals that simply say, I'm going to have my own flag and I'm going to have my own country. It's impossible, right? So we have one country, we have a constitution. Interestingly, the same constitution that was respected was crafted by the TPLF. The same federal arrangement, with the exception of the Sidama province being added as its own province, but the constitutional arrangement is still the same. I asked someone who is a TPLF official when this thing occurred. I asked them if the TPLF truly cares, the leadership, the political leadership, right? So these decisions to go to war were made by the leadership. I did not hear rallies. I didn't hear a referendum about this, right? This is a preemption. So that means, according to the TPLF narrative, there's groups that are going to attack us, is the narrative. These could be militias in the neighboring province of Amhara. It could be the federal government. And so if that's the case, how come no one discussed it outside a very small circle, right? So a very small circle, primarily of men from a different generation with a thought process that's frozen in time, decided to go to war. And war is a Pandora's box. When you go to war, you should understand that it's going to result in death, suffering, and brutality, right? That's why war, in terms of international law, starting a war is considered the supreme crime. So the act of aggression is considered the supreme crime under which all other crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, are going to come under. So one of the questions that I asked was, even if the central government of Ethiopia was going to make the self-rule in Tigray very difficult, even if, for instance, there's an invading army that was coming for the TPLF, I said, why didn't you sacrifice yourself? Since you are fighters and you're dedicating yourself to the interest of Tigray, you're older people, so why not sacrifice yourself? Because Tigray today, if that was the case, would be just like Somali region. Somali region does not have people starving. Somali region doesn't have all its factories and its infrastructure destroyed. Look at Somali region, almost the same population, but even at a lower economic development level than Tigray. Why couldn't Tigray be like the Somali region? What makes Tigray so special in terms of the kind of animus that the TPLF supposedly is talking about? It's fake. It's fake.
So
And then
to your point, Professor, about a thought process that's frozen in time and men of just a different, completely different generation, the defense minister of Ethiopia, Dr. Abraham Belai, recently said last week that the solution to Tigray is only possible when the people of Tigray take part in it. It was a statement that he put out in 3 different languages on social media. Of course, that's not going to reach the majority of the people in Tigray. So they've also been dropping leaflets into that region, from what I understand. They've also been trying to communicate more through the radio access that's available in much of that region, telling the people to separate themselves from the TPLF. A recent statement from the communication service in the Ethiopian government also said something similar. So I say that all to say, what would be I think what would be one of the worst things to happen out of these negotiations is they actually give to these TPLF leaders an opportunity to go back and run that region that they dragged into a war. And so what do you think about that? The people actually having to have these leaders be forced on them again. I mean, I would think it would be forced on them this time around after their experience.
I think we can look at the negotiations and the outcome of the negotiations at least at 2 levels. So first, Ethiopia, pan-Ethiopia wide at a national level. So at a national level, you cannot have 2 governments in one country. So first is the recognition that the elected government of Ethiopia is the government of Ethiopia, and it has authority over every single inch of Ethiopian territory. And any group that wants to come to power can only do so through the ballot box. Simple as that. Second, you can't have 2 armies in a country. And so that simply means that all regions have to disarm. If you have an army that you've constructed over 2 to 3 years, TPLF, I'm talking about you in Tigray, your army has to demobilize because you cannot have 2 armies in one country. Uh, Law and order, again, the lawlessness, even when the period in which the federal government left Tigray and simply allowed the TPLF to return and assume power, there was an element of lawlessness in Tigray itself, despite all the notion of an omnipotent TPLF, right? There was an element of lawlessness, there was an element of criminality, because when there is a lack of law or a weakening of the law, different groups, Gobazuch, different groups come and they make their own law, right? They'll have taxes that all of a sudden you're driving down the highway and you meet a group of people and they're going to tax you, right? So that's what happened, for instance, in Somalia when the state structure broke down and you didn't have law and order. So you have different groups that make their own law, that are the law. So one of the things that we need in Ethiopia, all regions, and this is not only in Tigray, there's other pockets as well where you have this tendency as well, is that we need law and order. Remember, the name of this campaign was actually a law and order campaign. Okay.
Law enforcement operation,
Law
right?
enforcement operation, exactly. The other thing is that it is unfair that Tigrayans have not been participants in this reform process. The reform process is still a baby, right? Remember that the legitimacy, so there's a very interesting thing about elections. So for instance, Western, let's call them donors, and maybe this can, why are they called donors? And that's an interesting aspect. Maybe one day we'll never call them donors, which I hope that would be a case. But Western donors look at the legitimacy of a government based upon this procedure called elections, right? But the legitimacy of the Abiy Ahmed government was actually based upon the popular demand for reform. So remember, it was a caretaker government within the first year, 2 years. And in that time period, there was a few elements of responding to the public, right? Opening up the political space, inviting everyone that had been chased out of the country back, allowing freedom of the press, people like yourself journalists were endangered species in Ethiopia. They were operating in an environment very much like it would be in Colombia or Mexico, where they'd be assassinated or killed for telling the truth, right? So you have then a level of legitimacy that is associated with particularly the personality of the prime minister, not necessarily the party, the Prosperity Party. People are still iffy about that. They don't know it. It's not really tested. But the prime minister and the mandate to do some sort of reform. Do you recall how the prime minister was greeted in Tigray, in Aksum, in Mekelle? So the Tigrayan people were not any different than any Ethiopian people. They also wanted to reform. But remember, the TPLF is against both reform within Ethiopia, specifically Ethiopia wide, but it's also against reform inside of Tigray. That goes directly against the interest of Tigrayans themselves, right? You mean to say that Tigrayans are against the freedom of the press, that Tigrayans are against greater level of good governance and accountability, of efficiency, of less corruption, of state institutions that are going to actually serve the public as opposed to being used for enriching individuals? So there's very key demands, and different provinces in Ethiopia, Kililoch, have unique questions, right? So for instance, Gambela was basically invaded, right? Invaded. And I think that has to be addressed in terms of the land grabs that occurred in Gambela and displaced citizens within Gambela. So different provinces have different questions, but with respect to Tigray, there was no breathing space. There wasn't even an opportunity for Tigrayans to actually begin to be participants and beneficiaries of this reform process. Secondarily, coming back to the outcomes of the negotiations with respect to not on a national level, pan-Ethiopian, but at a local level, looking at the province of Tigray itself. If the TPLF is given a political space within Ethiopia, I want you to think about this. So there are various political organizations in Ethiopia. Some of them are part of the coalition, PPP, others are not. Some of them have state power, others do not. I'll just give you an example. The Somali regional government is part of the coalition. And because of that, the new government, in terms of the Somali regional government, has a young team. President Mustafa has a young team, very capable. They're clean. They don't have blood on their hands. They're not really associated with the old regime. And they're making moves in their province. So now, if you bring the TPLF, what you're doing to the Tigray people is you're actually giving them perhaps the most despised political organization in Ethiopian history. It's just a fact. I'm being objective here. It's not my personal opinion. So if the TPLF is despised in Ethiopia, what does that mean? The TPLF is despised by our neighboring Eritrea. It's not to be trusted, right? The TPLF has an axe to grind with the neighbors, the most critical neighbors from Wello, Gojam, Gondar, Shoa, Amara region. The Afar state, what has been done has created such a huge rift towards the TPLF. So what that means then is it takes Tigray as a Khalil, even if there's peace, and makes it extremely marginal. It will not be part of the national process and dialogue. And its representation is going to be, again, very marginal. And secondarily, you have to remember any peace with regions around Tigray and any peace with Eritrea, the primary beneficiaries are going to be towns like Shire Selassie. Shire Selassie between what's called Wolkait and the sesame production area and Asmara was a transit area when you have peace. All the areas around the Eritrean-Ethiopian border would be booming. The port, Mizawa and Asab, primarily will serve the northern part of Ethiopia, not only Tigray, but all of the places like Wello and Gondar, etc., are going to be the primary beneficiaries. You cannot have a healthy Tigray without interrelationships. Tigrayans are one of the most industrious people, and they're also, and again, not to over exaggerate, but let's just call Tigrayans are like Gurage in the sense that, for me, I think they add spice and beauty to Ethiopia, marak, if you will, as one journalist had described Gurage, and they work everywhere. They go everywhere, right? They're in every particular region of Ethiopia. Um, Prior to the TPLF, never has there ever been any threat or any fear that a Tigrayan cannot be in Gondar, cannot be in Humara or Walqait, cannot be in Bahardar, cannot be in Jimma. Never ever has happened. So what you now have then is a political party that constantly feeds off of creating hate for the Tigrayan people, creating animosity with the most critical neighbors for the benefit of the Tigrayan people, and also creating barriers and impediments to the economic revival of Tigray. If Tigray now, when we think of post-conflict Tigray, if Tigray as a region is going to be an important part of Ethiopia and revive economically, which it can, it requires good relationships with its neighbors. Do you think the TPLF is capable of creating good relationships? Do you think the TPLF is trusted as an organization to be a mediator between the social trauma that's been caused so that you can have healing, trust building, and reconciliation? No, it's not. And so,
Right.
for that reason, I think it would be a travesty for Tigray. And lastly, anyone who studied the TPLF, very interesting sort of dynamic occurs, right? One is that it's unable to live without conflict. And second, it is willing to serve outside powers in order to serve its own group's interest. It is willing to serve outside powers in order to serve its own interests, which means to say that if the TPLF is allowed a space in Tigray, what makes you think that an opportunity, if it's given, would not be used again to serve as a destabilizing force, not only within Ethiopia, but the Horn of Africa?